They say a mother's love is unconditional, but they forget to mention that a mother's silence, when pushed to her absolute limit, carries the most devastating conditions of all. For Eleanor Vance, that limit was reached on a sun-drenched afternoon in Napa Valley, a day that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of her life. The wedding of her only son, Liam, was a masterpiece of elegance and opulence. Every detail, from the blush-pink peonies cascading from marble arches to the string quartet playing softly near the vineyard, had been personally curated and paid for by Eleanor. This was more than a wedding. It was the final, perfect brushstroke on the portrait of a life she had dedicated entirely to her son since her husband Richard's passing a decade ago. She stood near a century-old oak tree, watching the staff put the finishing touches on the reception area, her heart swelling with a bittersweet pride. In half an hour, guests would arrive. In an hour, her boy would be a husband. She smoothed the front of her silk dress, a quiet smile on her lips, when a voice, sweet as honey laced with ice, cut through her reverie. Eleanor. It was Amelia, the bride, looking ethereal in her gown, a vision of white lace and diamonds. But her eyes, as she drew Eleanor away from the main path and into the shadows of the estate house, held none of the warmth of a daughter-in-law. "Thank you for everything, Eleanor," Amelia began, her smile never reaching her eyes. "The wedding is beautiful, exactly as I imagined." She paused, letting the compliment hang in the air before delivering the blow. "But your role in it is now complete. Our guests will be arriving shortly, and it would be rather awkward to have to explain your presence. It's best if you leave now." The words struck Eleanor with the force of a physical impact, stealing the air from her lungs. She looked past Amelia's triumphant smirk, her gaze searching for her son, Liam, who stood just behind his bride. She looked for a sign of protest, a flicker of confusion, a hint of the boy she had raised. She found nothing. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second before darting away, his silence the most profound betrayal of all. In that moment, the heart of a mother did not just break, it atomized, turning from searing pain into something cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear. A strange calm washed over Eleanor. She looked back at Amelia, and for the first time, saw the predator beneath the polished facade. A slow, serene smile spread across Eleanor's own face. She simply nodded once, a gesture of graceful concession, turned without a word, and walked away. Her steps were measured and steady as she crossed the manicured lawn to her car. But the moment the heavy door clicked shut, the performance ended. She did not cry. She simply pulled out her phone. Her first call was to the wedding venue's coordinator. Her voice was placid, almost unnervingly gentle. "This is Eleanor Vance. There has been a material breach of contract. All services are to be terminated, effective immediately. Click." The second call was to the five-star catering company. "All payments are to be stopped. The event is canceled. Click." The third, to the band. The fourth, to the florist. Each call was the same. A calm, quiet severing of the ties that had built this perfect day, dismantling her masterpiece with the same precision she had used to create it. The wedding was over, but the consequences had just begun. To understand the steel that forged itself in Eleanor Vance's heart as she drove away from the ruins of her son's wedding, you must first understand the life she had built and the sacrifices she had made to protect it. Her story was not one of inherited wealth, but of a fortress built brick by brick, alongside the only man she had ever loved. Eleanor and Richard Vance were a force of nature in the world of architecture. They had met in college, two brilliant minds drawn together by a shared passion for clean lines and impossible structures. While other couples were planning dates, they were sketching blueprints on coffee shop napkins, dreaming of a city skyline they could one day call their own. They started Vance and Associates in a cramped, rented office with a second-hand drafting table and an unshakable belief in each other. Richard was the visionary, the poet of space and light. He could charm a skeptical city council with a single speech, painting pictures with his words that made steel and glass feel like living art. But Eleanor was the architect. She was the one who made the poetry possible, the one who understood the unforgiving mathematics of stress and load, the quiet genius who could turn Richard's soaring fantasies into tangible, breathtaking reality. Together, they conquered the industry. Their firm's name became synonymous with cutting-edge design and unwavering quality. They were a perfect partnership in business and in life, their love story written in the foundations of skyscrapers and the sweeping curves of concert halls. Their greatest collaboration, however, was their son, Liam. From the moment he was born, Liam became the new center of their shared universe, the one project that mattered more than any award-winning design. They were a family, whole and complete, standing at the pinnacle of a world they had built themselves. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, that world ceased to exist. Richard, at the age of 45, suffered a massive heart attack on the 17th hole of a golf course. He was gone before the paramedics arrived. The news reached Eleanor in the middle of a client meeting. One moment, she was negotiating a multi-million-dollar contract. The next, the floor had fallen out from beneath her, leaving her in a free fall of grief. In the aftermath, a legion of advisors, friends, and colleagues descended upon her, all offering the same advice: sell the firm. They told her it was too much for one person, that Richard was the face of the company, that she should take the fortune they had amassed and live a quiet life for herself and her son. They underestimated her. Eleanor was not just Richard's wife, she was his partner, the co-architect of their empire. Letting it go would be like letting him die a second time. Yet, when she looked at Liam, then a quiet, grief-stricken 18-year-old on the cusp of heading to college, she saw a different truth. The empire didn't matter if the heir to it was lost. Richard's greatest legacy wasn't a building, it was their son. And so, Eleanor made a calculated decision. She would not sell the entire firm, but she would sell her controlling interest. She brokered a deal that was a masterstroke of business strategy, retaining a significant share and a permanent seat on the board, ensuring her financial independence forever, but relinquishing the grueling day-to-day responsibilities. She stepped back from being a CEO to become something far more important: a full-time mother to a son who had just lost his father. The world of architecture mourned the loss of her talent, but Eleanor never looked back. Her life was now a singular project: Liam. She poured everything into him. She didn't just give him money, she gave him her entire existence. She was at every parent-teacher conference, every university event. When he showed a fleeting interest in photography, she bought him the best equipment and converted a room into a dark room. When he decided he wanted to get an MBA after his arts degree, she paid for the finest tutors to ensure his admission. She took him on tours of Europe, not as a tourist, but as a student, guiding him through the architectural marvels she and Richard had once dreamed of seeing together, hoping to ignite in him the spark that had once defined their lives. She smoothed every path, removed every obstacle. Liam never had to worry about a bill, a deadline, or a difficult decision. His life was a frictionless existence, curated and maintained by his mother's tireless, invisible work. Liam, in turn, grew into a fine young man. He was handsome, intelligent, and possessed an easy charm that drew people to him. He loved his mother, of course, in the comfortable, abstract way a person loves the sun that has always risen for them. He was grateful for his life, but he had no concept of its cost. He saw his mother's sacrifice not as a choice she made, but as the natural state of her being. Her boundless support was simply a feature of his world, as reliable and unquestioned as gravity. He never truly understood that the easy ground he walked on was paved with the dreams she had willingly set aside. This was the boy, now a man of 28, who had stood silently behind his bride as she cast his mother out. He wasn't cruel, not in his heart. He was simply weak, a product of a love so complete it had failed to forge in him the one thing he needed most: a spine. He had spent his life in the shelter of his mother's fortress, never realizing that he, himself, was meant to be its guardian. His betrayal was not an act of malice, but of a profound, sheltered ignorance. And for Eleanor, that was the most unforgivable sin of all. Amelia entered their lives on a wave of champagne bubbles and polite applause at a charity gala for the city's new modern art wing. Eleanor had almost decided not to go, but Liam had insisted, and she never could deny him much. She first saw the woman who would become her daughter-in-law across the crowded room, a statuesque brunette in an emerald green dress, holding a small circle of admirers, captive with a radiant smile. There was something intensely polished about her, a practiced elegance that stood out even in a room filled with the city's elite. Later, Liam brought her over, his face flushed with an excitement Eleanor hadn't seen in years. "Mom, I'd like you to meet Amelia Dubois," he said, his voice brimming with pride. Amelia's performance was flawless. She extended a delicate hand to Eleanor, her handshake firm but respectful. "It is an absolute honor to meet you, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice a cultivated melody of mid-Atlantic vowels. "Liam has told me so much about you. Your work on the Callaway Tower is legendary." She spoke with an easy intelligence, referencing art, literature, and global finance with a casual grace that suggested a life of privilege and exceptional education. She explained that her family, based primarily in Geneva, was in international shipping, a discreet old money empire that valued privacy above all else. She herself had attended a prestigious boarding school in Switzerland before finishing her studies in art history at Oxford. She was, in every conceivable way, the perfect match for a man like Liam. She was his equal in sophistication, yet she directed all her attention to him, her eyes lighting up when he spoke, making him feel not just heard, but revered. For Liam, it was instantaneous and absolute. He was utterly captivated, blinded by the dazzling light of her apparent perfection. For Eleanor, however, beneath the surface of the charm, tiny, almost imperceptible dissonances began to emerge. They were nothing she could name at first, just a faint, unsettling feeling, the emotional equivalent of a note played slightly out of tune. During a dinner a few weeks later, Eleanor, a passionate oenophile, casually mentioned a small, exceptional vineyard she and Richard had once visited in Tuscany, not far from where Amelia had claimed her family kept a summer villa. She asked Amelia if she knew it. For a fraction of a second, a blankness washed over Amelia's eyes before her brilliant smile clicked back into place. "Oh, of course," she'd laughed lightly. "But we were always so terribly busy with family. We rarely ventured out." It was a plausible answer, yet the momentary hesitation felt like a crack in a perfect vase. Another time, while discussing education, Eleanor mentioned the long-serving, famously eccentric headmaster of the very Swiss school Amelia claimed as her alma mater. Amelia agreed enthusiastically, but referred to him by the wrong first name, a small, insignificant slip that she quickly corrected. But Eleanor had noticed. The stories of her family's shipping empire were always grand and sweeping. Yet, when a family friend, who actually worked in maritime logistics, tried to engage her on the finer points of the Suez Canal's tariff structures, her answers became beautifully vague, deflecting with a self-deprecating laugh about how she always left the boring details to her father. Each incident on its own was meaningless, easily dismissed as a trick of memory or a simple misstatement. But together, they began to form a pattern, a quiet hum of inconsistency beneath the symphony of her charm. One evening, after Amelia had left their home, Eleanor decided to voice her concerns. She approached it carefully, her tone gentle. "Liam, darling," she began, "Amelia is a wonderful young woman, so intelligent. I just find it curious. She seems very private about her family. We haven't even seen a photograph of her parents." Liam, who had been glowing just moments before, immediately stiffened. His smile vanished, replaced by a defensive scowl. "What are you trying to say, Mom?" he asked, his voice sharp. "That there's something wrong with her?" Eleanor raised her hands placatingly. "Not at all. I'm just trying to get to know the woman my son is so clearly in love with." "No, you're not," he shot back, his voice rising. "You're interrogating her. You're looking for flaws. You've been doing it since the day I met her. Can't you just be happy for me? For once? Ever since Dad died, you've wrapped me in cotton wool, and now that I've finally found someone who makes me truly happy, you want to tear her down because she's not someone you picked out for me." The words, so unfair and so deeply wounding, struck Eleanor with the force of a slap. She saw in his eyes a stubborn, willful blindness that she knew she could not penetrate with logic. To push further would be to risk the one thing she could not bear to lose, her relationship with her son. An iron gate was slamming shut between them, and she could see Amelia's smiling face on the other side. In that moment, Eleanor made a fateful choice. She surrendered. Her intuition, the razor-sharp instinct that had guided her through boardroom battles and complex architectural designs, was screaming that Amelia Dubois was a fiction. But the love for her son and the terror of being cast as the jealous, overbearing mother screamed louder. She forced a smile, the taste of ashes in her mouth. "You're right, darling," she said softly, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. "I'm sorry. My old habits die hard. She makes you happy, and that is all that matters." She convinced herself it was the right thing to do. She told herself that her fears were the product of a lonely heart, that her protective instincts had curdled into paranoia. She chose to trust her son's happiness over her own gut feeling. And so, for the next year, she played her part. She hosted engagement parties, admired the ridiculously large diamond on Amelia's finger, and wrote check after check for the wedding of their dreams. All the while, she buried her doubts under a placid surface of maternal support, ignoring the cold, persistent whisper in the back of her mind that warned she was not just planning a wedding, she was funding the invasion of her own life. The moment the engagement was official, the wedding planning began, and what Eleanor had hoped would be a joyous collaboration quickly devolved into a quiet, brutal war of attrition. It began subtly in the plush, cream-colored offices of Julianne Croft, the most sought-after wedding planner in San Francisco, a woman Eleanor had known both professionally and socially for years. Eleanor had envisioned the three of them, mother, son, and bride, to be laughing over fabric swatches and cake samples, weaving together a day that honored both family tradition and the couple's modern tastes. Amelia, it turned out, had a very different vision. She arrived at the first meeting not with ideas, but with decrees. She carried a thick, leather-bound portfolio, already tabbed and organized, detailing a wedding so extravagant it would have been appropriate for European royalty. Julianne, ever the diplomat, gently tried to steer the conversation towards more grounded options, presenting a budget forecast based on Eleanor's generous but sensible initial figures. Amelia simply smiled, a serene, unshakable expression on her face. "Oh, Julianne, your work is divine truly," she said, flipping past the planner's proposals. "But Liam and I have a vision that's a little more bespoke." For every suggestion Eleanor made, Amelia had a counter-proposal that was twice as expensive and served to quietly push Eleanor to the margins. When Eleanor suggested the country club where she and Richard had held their own wedding reception, a place full of sentiment, Amelia patted her hand. "What a sweet thought, Eleanor. So wonderfully traditional. But we want a full weekend experience for our guests. A destination. We're thinking a private buyout of one of the top estates in Napa." When Eleanor proposed a classic tiered cake from a beloved local baker, Amelia sighed. "The thing is, we're flying in a pastry chef from Paris. He's an artist. He doesn't do cake. He creates sugar sculptures." Each exchange was a masterclass in passive aggression. Amelia never disagreed directly. She simply framed Eleanor's tastes as quaint, dated, or provincial. Liam, caught in the middle, was completely blind to the subtext. He saw a confident, decisive fiancée who knew what she wanted, and a mother who seemed to be questioning her every move. The budget quickly became Amelia's primary weapon. The numbers spiraled into the stratosphere. Custom linens from Italy, rare orchids flown in from Thailand, a celebrity photographer who charged by the minute. When Eleanor finally sat down with Liam, gently expressing her concern over the astronomical costs, the trap was sprung. He returned from his next dinner with Amelia with a look of pained apology. "Mom," he said, his tone heavy with rehearsed sincerity, "Amelia feels terrible. She's worried you think she's some kind of gold digger. She told me maybe we should just forget the whole thing and elope so we don't feel like a burden to you." It was a checkmate. Eleanor was left with two choices: write the checks, or be positioned as the monster who was destroying her son's happiness over something as crass as money. She felt a cold fury rise within her, but she swallowed it, forcing a smile. Of course not, darling. It's her special day. Whatever she wants. The incident was a turning point. From then on, Liam viewed every one of his mother's financial questions not as prudent oversight, but as a personal attack on his fiancée. He became Amelia's staunchest defender, her willing shield against his own mother's influence. The final humiliation came during the search for a wedding gown. Eleanor had been invited, but it was clear her presence was a formality. They were in an exclusive, appointment-only boutique in a part of the city where prices were not listed on the tags. Eleanor watched as Amelia tried on dress after dress, a blur of silk and tulle. She found herself drawn to a timeless, elegant gown with delicate lace sleeves and a classic silhouette. "Oh, Amelia, that one is breathtaking," Eleanor said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "It's so graceful." Amelia looked at herself in the mirror, then at Eleanor's reflection. "It is lovely, isn't it?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It would have been absolutely perfect for a wedding in your day." She then turned to the sales assistant and pointed to the most dramatic, ostentatious, and ruinously expensive gown in the showroom. "I'll take that one," she declared. In that moment, Eleanor was not a mother sharing a cherished memory. She was a relic, a living antique, whose opinion was noted with the same polite indulgence one might grant a senile grandmother. As the wedding date grew closer, Eleanor found herself completely isolated. She was the bank, but she had no seat at the table. Decisions were made in text message chains she was not a part of. Contracts were signed without her review. She would learn of a new 5-figure charge for an artisanal ice sculpture or a flock of doves to be released during the ceremony only when the invoice appeared in her accountant's inbox. When she tried to ask Liam for details, he would sigh, a sound of pure, unadulterated exasperation. "Mom, please. Amelia has everything under control. You raised me to trust the people I love, didn't you? Well, I trust her. Just enjoy being the mother of the groom. That's all you have to do." But Eleanor knew that her role had been reduced to something far less noble. She was no longer the matriarch of the family. She was merely its silent, obedient benefactor, and her signature on a check was the only opinion that was still required. She kept smiling, kept paying, kept reassuring Liam that everything was fine. But inside, the foundation of a mother's unconditional love was cracking under the immense pressure, and a different, harder substance was beginning to form in its place. The world seemed to shrink and warp around Amelia's final words, the sound of the string quartet in the distance becoming a shrill, mocking screech in Eleanor's ears. For a long, silent moment, she did nothing but study the two people in front of her. She saw Amelia's chest rise and fall in a steady, triumphant rhythm, her face a placid mask of victory. And she saw Liam, her son, her life's work, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze fixed on a distant patch of immaculately manicured grass. He was a statue of cowardice, a monument to his own betrayal. He would not, or could not, defend her. The pain was a physical thing, a white-hot spike driving straight through her heart. But what followed was not an outcry, not a flood of tears, but a sudden, terrifying absence of feeling. It was as if a circuit breaker had been tripped inside her soul, plunging the cavern of her grief into a cold, profound darkness. Her smile, when it came, felt alien on her own face. It was a serene, detached expression that did not touch her eyes. "I see," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "I wouldn't want to be an inconvenience." She gave a single, crisp nod, turned, and began to walk away. Each step was a deliberate, measured act of will. She could feel the wedding planner's horrified stare from across the lawn, the frantic, questioning glances of the catering staff. They knew who she was. They knew whose name was on the checks that paid for every petal, every crystal glass, every perfectly folded napkin. Her quiet, solitary exit was a spectacle of supreme humiliation, a queen being exiled from the castle she herself had built. She did not hurry. She walked with the unshakable poise of a woman heading to a board meeting, not one being cast out of her own family. The heavy door of her Mercedes closed with a solid, definitive thud, sealing her inside a capsule of silent, air-conditioned leather. The mask dropped, but she did not weep. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a tectonic shift, a fundamental restructuring of her inner world. The loving, self-sacrificing mother who had driven to this estate a few hours ago had ceased to exist. In her place, something else was stirring. Something older, harder, and far more dangerous. It was the Eleanor Vance who had stared down contractors and demolished the arguments of corporate lawyers. The woman who had built an empire with her husband and then held it together alone after his death. For 10 years, that woman had been dormant, her ferocious energy channeled exclusively into the gentle, nurturing project of raising Liam. Now, that project had been declared a catastrophic failure. The energy had nowhere to go, and it began to coil within her, hot and powerful, like molten steel. She stared at her own reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back was pale, but the eyes were clear, burning with a cold fire she had not seen in a decade. The grief for the son she had lost was already crystallizing into something else: resolve. This was not a family dispute. This was a hostile takeover. And Eleanor Vance had never, in her entire life, walked away from a fight. She picked up her phone. Her fingers were perfectly steady as she navigated to her contacts. Her voice, when she spoke to the venue coordinator, was the epitome of professional courtesy. Maria Eleanor Vance. I'm afraid a situation has arisen that constitutes a fundamental breach of our agreement. We will be terminating the event, effective immediately, as per Section 7, Subclause B of our contract regarding client welfare. I trust my lawyers will be in touch to handle the dissolution. There was no anger, only the clipped, precise language of business. She was not a scorned mother. She was a client whose terms had been violated. The next calls were a rapid-fire sequence of surgical strikes. To the caterer, services are no longer required. To the florist, cease all further arrangements. To the acclaimed Parisian pastry chef, your contract is void. With each call, she was dismantling the day, pulling the plug on the elaborate fantasy she had so foolishly funded. But these were merely tactical maneuvers. The truly strategic move, the one that would change the nature of the war, was her final call. She dialed the private number of David Chen, the family's lawyer for over 30 years, a man who had been a friend to Richard. "David, it's Eleanor," she said, her voice low and steady. "I have an urgent directive. I want you to file an emergency injunction to freeze the Sterling Trust Fund." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Eleanor? You mean Liam's trust? On what grounds?" "On the grounds that its primary beneficiary has proven himself to be of unsound judgment and is currently under undue influence," she stated, the legal terminology flowing effortlessly. "All access, all disbursements, all lines of credit associated with it are to be suspended, effective immediately, pending a full and thorough review of his personal and financial entanglements. There is no room for negotiation on this, David. I am invoking my rights as the trustee. Make it happen." She ended the call before he could argue further. This was no longer about a ruined wedding party. This was about protecting the Vance legacy from the predator she had invited into their lives, and from the son who had so willingly held the door open for her. She started the car and pulled away from the estate, not looking back. She could already imagine the chaos erupting behind her, the frantic phone calls, the confused vendors, the slow, dawning horror on Liam and Amelia's faces as their perfect day dissolved into an administrative and financial nightmare. But Eleanor felt nothing. She drove through the rolling, sun-kissed hills of Napa Valley, a serene expression on her face. She arrived at her silent, empty home, the grand foyer that should have been awaiting a happy couple now feeling like a command center. She walked to the liquor cabinet, the one she and Richard had installed, and poured a healthy measure of his favorite 18-year-old single malt scotch into a crystal tumbler. She took a sip, the fiery liquid a welcome burn in her throat. The pain was still there, a cold, heavy stone in her chest, but it was no longer her master. It was now her fuel. The wedding was over. The war had just begun. The days immediately following the non-wedding were a symphony of chaos that Eleanor observed from a distance, as if watching a storm rage over a neighboring valley. Her phone was a constant barrage of notifications, dozens of missed calls from a frantic Liam, a string of increasingly desperate, then angry, then pleading text messages, voicemails from confused and concerned friends, asking if everyone was all right. She ignored them all. She had constructed a fortress of silence around herself, and within its walls, there was no room for emotion. Grief was a luxury. Anger was a distraction. What she needed now was clarity and the cold, hard currency of information. She did not waste time nursing her wounds. She began to methodically assemble her weapons. On Monday morning, while Liam was likely waking up to the full-scale logistical and social nightmare she had created, Eleanor was in a discreet, wood-paneled private room at a downtown athletic club she hadn't visited in years. Across the polished mahogany table sat a man named Marcus Sterling. He was not the kind of private investigator one saw in movies. There was no rumpled trench coat or cynical demeanor. Sterling was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his manner as precise and unobtrusive as a neurosurgeon's. His firm, Sterling Solutions, was one of the most exclusive and expensive corporate intelligence agencies in the country, specializing in the kind of deep background vetting that made or broke billion-dollar mergers. Eleanor had used him once before, a decade ago, to discreetly investigate a potential business partner of Richard's. She had kept his number for just such an occasion, a contingency she hoped she would never need. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice, Marcus," Eleanor began, her voice even and calm. She slid a tablet across the table. On the screen was a professionally shot engagement photograph of Liam and Amelia, smiling blissfully. "This woman," Eleanor said, her finger tapping on Amelia's face. "Her name, as she calls herself, is Amelia Dubois. She is engaged to my son. I want to know everything about her." Sterling looked at the photo, his face impassive. "What is it you're looking for, Eleanor? Infidelity? A prenuptial concern?" Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "I am not looking for suspicions, Marcus. I am looking for a verifiable history. I want to know who she was before she was Amelia Dubois. I want bank records, school transcripts, travel manifests, birth certificates. I want to know every name she has ever used, every address she has ever lived at, and every person she has ever been entangled with. I want to know where she came from and how she got here. Your budget," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is unlimited. Your only constraint is absolute discretion. My son is not to know. No one island." Sterling simply nodded, absorbing the directive. "I understand completely. We'll begin immediately." With the hunt underway, Eleanor turned her focus inward, not to her pain, but to her power. She systematically began reclaiming the parts of her life she had ceded to motherhood. She started going into the office of Vance and Associates every day. Her former partners, who now ran the firm, were surprised but delighted. They had missed her sharp eye and intuitive grasp of complex projects. She immersed herself in blueprints and structural reports, the familiar, clean logic of architecture, a soothing balm for her fractured soul. She was reconnecting with the woman she had been before Liam became her entire world, a formidable, respected, and brilliant professional. It was her armor. Meanwhile, Liam's attempts to breach her fortress grew more desperate. He left long, rambling voicemails, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and confusion. He sent texts that cycled through rage, apology, and accusations. He even came to the house, standing outside the gates for over an hour, but she had instructed her security staff not to grant him access. She was cutting off his supply of emotional and financial support, forcing him, for the first time in his life, to exist in the uncomfortable silence of his own consequences. Exactly 1 week after her meeting with Sterling, a notification appeared on her encrypted laptop. A single, discrete file had arrived. That night, Eleanor sat in her home study, the room Richard had designed, surrounded by books on art and architecture. The only light came from the glow of the screen, casting long shadows across the room. She opened the file. It was a preliminary report, a first look into the life of Amelia Dubois, and it was everything she had suspected, yet somehow, so much worse. The first section was education. Sterling's team had contacted the registrars at both Oxford University and the exclusive Swiss academy Amelia had claimed. The result was unequivocal. No one named Amelia Dubois, nor any of the other possible names they had cross-referenced, had ever been enrolled. Her entire academic history was a fabrication. The next section was family. The Dubois shipping dynasty of Geneva did not exist. There was no patriarch, no summer villa, no vast network of familial wealth. It was a phantom, a story created from whole cloth, likely borrowed from the pages of a society magazine. Then came the finances. Amelia had arrived in San Francisco 18 months prior with a bank account containing just under $5,000. Since meeting Liam, hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts, allowances, and direct payments had flowed into her accounts, which she had been systematically moving to offshore, untraceable holdings. But the final section of the report was the one that made the blood run cold in Eleanor's veins. Titled Prior Associations, it contained two other names linked to Amelia's photograph by facial recognition software. In Miami, she was known as Sophia Rossi, an Italian heiress who had a 6-month relationship with the son of a hotel magnate, a relationship that ended when she vanished after receiving a $250,000 loan to help with a non-existent family emergency. Before that, in Denver, she was Chloe Martin, the supposed daughter of a Texas oilman who had disappeared after her fiancé signed over the deed to a luxury condominium as an early wedding present. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the screen's cold light illuminating her face. There was no shock, no surge of victorious anger. There was only the grim, hollow certainty of vindication. Her instincts had been right all along. She had not been a paranoid mother. She had been a sleeping watchdog who had failed to notice the fox already inside the hen house. Liam had not fallen in love with an unsuitable woman. He had been targeted and captured by a professional predator, a ghost who constructed new lives as easily as Eleanor designed buildings. The report was not an ending. It was a table of contents. She opened a secure messaging app and sent a single reply to Marcus Sterling. "This is a good start. Now, dig deeper. I don't care about these aliases. I want her birth name. I want her real family. I want to know the town she was born in and the house she grew up in. Find the original lie." The directive Eleanor had given to Marcus Sterling shifted the nature of his investigation from a digital background check to a forensic manhunt for a ghost. The trail of Amelia Dubois and her previous aliases was a carefully constructed labyrinth of dead ends. The offshore bank accounts were layered behind impenetrable shell corporations, and the identities she had used were like discarded costumes, leaving behind only faint traces of perfume and a handful of duped lovers. For 2 weeks, Sterling's team chased these phantoms across the country, hitting firewall after firewall. They found the condo in Denver, long since sold. They found the jilted hotel heir in Miami, who was too embarrassed and legally constrained by a non-disclosure agreement he'd been forced to sign to say much at all. The woman they were hunting was a professional, an expert at erasing her own footsteps. The breakthrough, when it came, was not from a witness, but from a single, overlooked digital breadcrumb. One of Sterling's cybersecurity experts, a relentless young man who specialized in data recovery, was re-examining the digital ghost of Sophia Rossi. He found a social media account that had been deleted years ago, but faint traces of it still existed on archived servers. He managed to recover a single, corrupted photo file. It was a picture of a sunset over a generic-looking lake, but embedded deep within the corrupted metadata, like a fossil trapped in amber, was a single, partial GPS coordinate. The coordinate did not point to the sun-drenched coasts of Florida. It pointed to a small, forgotten corner of the country, Northwood, Pennsylvania, a dying town in the heart of the Rust Belt. It was a lead so incongruous, so completely at odds with the sophisticated persona of Amelia Dubois, that it had to be the truth. Sterling dispatched an operative, a discreet man who blended into the background, to Northwood. What he found was a world away from the charity galas and Napa vineyards. Northwood was a town of shuttered factories, boarded-up storefronts, and quiet, desperate resilience. It was the kind of place people dreamed of escaping from, not returning to. In the dusty archives of the local library, the operative found what he was looking for, a Northwood High School yearbook from 10 years prior. And there, on page 87, under the hopeful, smiling face of a girl with familiar eyes and a different, harder set to her jaw, was the name, Sarah Jenkins. The caption beneath her photo read, "Most likely to see the world." Once they had her real name, the wall of lies collapsed. Sarah Jenkins was not a ghost. She was a person, with a history etched in public records and painful local memory. She was the only daughter of Daniel and Mary Jenkins. For years, they had been a typical, hard-working Northwood family. Daniel owned a small but respected local construction company, Jenkins Contracting. He was known as an honest man who did solid work. But around 15 years ago, their modest life had imploded. Sterling's operative pieced together the story from old court filings and archived articles in the Northwood Chronicle. Daniel Jenkins had won the subcontracting bid for the steel framework on a massive corporate office park being built 2 towns over. It was the biggest job of his life, a contract that promised to elevate his company to a new level. The primary developer and architect for that project was a prestigious, fast-growing firm from the city, Vance and Associates. The records told a familiar, brutal story of big fish versus little fish. There were disputes over materials, over timelines, over costs that ran higher than Daniel Jenkins' low bid could sustain. Richard and Eleanor Vance, at the height of their ambition, had run their project with ruthless efficiency. They held Jenkins to the absolute letter of a contract he was failing to meet. When his company faltered, Vance and Associates did not negotiate. They sued. They sued for breach of contract, for project delays, and for the cost of hiring a new firm to fix his mistakes. The legal onslaught was overwhelming. Jenkins Contracting was bankrupted. The family home was foreclosed on. The articles described a sheriff's auction on the courthouse steps, a lifetime of work sold off to strangers for pennies on the dollar. The final piece of the puzzle was a small 3-sentence obituary in the back of the paper, dated 6 months after the bankruptcy auction. Daniel Jenkins, age 49, had taken his own life. Back in her San Francisco study, the city lights twinkling like a sea of distant, unfeeling stars, Eleanor read the final report from Sterling. She saw the yearbook photo of the young Sarah Jenkins, her eyes full of a desperate, hungry ambition. She read the name of the project, the Northgate Corporate Campus. A cold, forgotten memory flickered in her mind. She remembered the project, vaguely. She remembered Richard being frustrated with a difficult subcontractor. He had called him a local yokel in over his head. He had handled it, he told her, with his characteristic efficiency. She had never given it a second thought. Then she read the name Daniel Jenkins, and the world tilted on its axis. It all became devastatingly clear. This was never just about money. This was a vendetta, a meticulously planned revenge, 15 years in the making. Sarah Jenkins had not simply stumbled upon Liam. She had hunted him. She had studied her enemy, identified their greatest vulnerability, their beloved, sheltered son, and she had crafted the perfect weapon in the form of Amelia Dubois to strike at the heart of their family. The demand for the most expensive wedding was not just greed. It was poetic justice, a way to make the Vances bleed money, just as her father had. The public humiliation of Eleanor was not just cruelty. It was a targeted act to strip away the matriarch's power, just as her family had been stripped of their home and dignity. Sarah was not trying to join the Vance family. She was trying to become a cancer within it, to hollow it out from the inside and leave it a bankrupt, broken ruin, an echo of what had happened to her own. Eleanor slowly stood up and walked over to the large, framed portrait of Richard that hung over the fireplace. He looked back at her, smiling, forever confident and handsome. She had spent the last decade preserving the memory of this perfect man, this perfect husband and father. But for the first time, she looked at his portrait and saw a stranger. She saw a ruthless businessman who had crushed a small man to make a point, a man whose ambition had left a body in its wake. The foundation of her own perfect life, she realized, was built on the rubble of someone else's. And Sarah Jenkins was the ghost of that rubble, who had come back not to haunt them, but to bury them. The knowledge of Sarah Jenkins' true identity and her deep-rooted vendetta was a key, but it only opened one of the locks. Eleanor now understood the motive, the powerful, toxic why that had fueled this elaborate deception, but to truly defeat her enemy, she needed to understand the how. She needed a map of the financial and legal web Sarah had woven around her son. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind the cold, clear atmosphere of a corporate crisis, and Eleanor, the CEO, was back in her element. She convened a meeting in her home study, which had now been transformed into a war room. The attendees were the two men she trusted most in the world, aside from the husband and son who were now both, in their own ways, lost to her. David Chen, the sharp, cautious family lawyer, sat to her right. To her left was Arthur Schmidt, a forensic accountant in his late 60s with the quiet, unassuming demeanor of a librarian and the mind of a bloodhound. For 30 years, Arthur had managed the Vance family's wealth, tracking every investment and guarding it with fierce loyalty. On the large oak desk between them lay a printed copy of Sterling's report on Sarah Jenkins. Eleanor let them read it in silence. When they were finished, David let out a long, slow whistle, while Arthur simply polished his glasses, his expression grim. "We know who she is, and we know what she wants," Eleanor stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "She wants to burn down everything Richard and I built. Now, I need to know how much kindling my son has handed her." Her directive was simple. "I want a complete forensic audit of every financial transaction Liam has made since the day he met this woman. Bank accounts, credit cards, investment portfolios, trust disbursements. I want you to examine every legal document he has signed. I am granting you both full, unrestricted access. I need to know the extent of the damage." For the next 72 hours, David and Arthur plunged into the digital life of Liam Vance. It was a painstaking process of following the money, and what they found was a slow, methodical exsanguination. Arthur was the first to identify the pattern, which he grimly nicknamed the romance tax. It started small. Lavish gifts, a $50,000 Cartier watch, a vintage Chanel bag, a weekend trip to Paris on a private jet. These were chalked up to the excesses of a young man in love. But then, the cash transfers began. First, a wire for $100,000 to an account belonging to Amelia. The memo line, written by Liam, read "Loan for Friend's gallery opening." Arthur's quick investigation revealed the friend and the gallery were fictitious. The money had been immediately rerouted to an offshore account. More followed. Funds for a non-existent family medical emergency in Geneva, seed money for a bogus tech startup she claimed her brother was launching. Liam was not just funding a lifestyle, he was unknowingly financing her entire operation, a steady siphoning of his liquid assets into her untraceable coffers. While Arthur tracked the money, David Chen examined the legal documents. Most were mundane apartment leases, service agreements for the wedding. But then he found it, buried deep within a thick stack of paperwork for a luxury condo they had planned to rent together. It was a durable power of attorney document. It was broad, comprehensive, and written in dense legalese. It would have given Amelia, or whoever she designated, complete control over Liam's financial affairs, the power to buy and sell assets, to enter into contracts, and to make decisions about his inheritance, should he be deemed incapacitated. It was a legal dagger, and Liam had signed it. His signature was right there, a careless, trusting scrawl on the final page. "He told me he thought it was just a standard part of the rental application," David said, his voice tight with disbelief. He never read it. By some miracle of timing, the document had not yet been notarized and filed. The wedding's cancellation had inadvertently stopped this part of the plot dead in its tracks. But the most sinister discovery came from a joint analysis. Arthur flagged a recent, major transaction from Liam's personal investment portfolio, a $2 million investment into something called the Helios Art and Antiquities Fund. On the surface, it looked legitimate. It had a glossy prospectus and a prestigious address in the Cayman Islands. But Arthur's instincts told him something was wrong. He dug deeper, peeling back the layers of shell corporations. What he found was chilling. The fund was a ghost. It had no other investors. Its entire portfolio consisted of Liam's $2 million. and the sole director and signatory on the corporate documents was a woman named Helene de la Croix, a name that was, according to Marcus Sterling's international database, another one of Sarah Jenkins' established aliases. She had created an entire, fraudulent investment fund for the sole purpose of tricking Liam into handing over a substantial piece of his inheritance. When David and Arthur presented their findings, Eleanor listened in absolute silence, her hands folded calmly on the desk. They laid out the full anatomy of the conspiracy. It was a three-phase assault. Phase 1, which was well underway, was to drain Liam's personal wealth. Phase 2, which had been narrowly averted, was to secure total legal control of his assets through the power of attorney. The final, terrifying Phase 3 would have begun after the wedding. Once she controlled his finances and, by extension, his future seat on the board of Vance & Associates, she could have begun her true work, to systematically sabotage, devalue, and dismantle the company from the inside. She would have used the Vance fortune to destroy the Vance legacy. Any last, lingering ember of maternal pity Eleanor might have felt for her son's plight was extinguished. Liam was not merely a fool who had been deceived by a clever woman. He had been a willing security breach, a compromised asset who, through his weakness and willful blindness, had nearly handed the enemy the schematics to the entire fortress. The threat was no longer personal or emotional. It was corporate and existential. She looked at the two men who had dedicated their careers to protecting her family. "She wanted to destroy my husband's legacy," Eleanor said, her voice soft but as sharp as broken glass. "Instead, I will erase hers." She stood up, her decision made. The defensive posture was over. It was time to attack. "David," she commanded, "I want you to begin drafting a civil complaint. We're suing for fraud, fraudulent inducement, and conspiracy. I want every asset she has, here and abroad, frozen. Arthur, I want you to work with Sterling's firm to trace every single dollar. We are going to claw back everything she stole, down to the last cent. She thought she could take from us without consequence. We are about to teach her what a consequence truly island." The shift from defense to offense transformed Eleanor. The quiet, wounded stillness was replaced by a focused, formidable energy that her colleagues from decades past would have recognized instantly. She began to move with the meticulous precision of an architect planning a skyscraper, where every calculation must be perfect and every component must be flawlessly aligned before the first piece of steel is ever moved. Her project now was not a building, but a dismantling. The justice she envisioned was not a chaotic, emotional outburst, but a cold, elegant, and inescapable structure of truth. Her first step was to consolidate her arsenal. Working with Sterling, Chen, and Schmidt, she began to assemble a comprehensive dossier, a meticulous narrative of Sarah Jenkins's entire fraudulent enterprise. It was not a mere collection of facts, but a story designed to be told, piece by damning piece. The dossier, bound in dark blue leather and simply titled Project Nightingale, a private code name Eleanor chose for the way Sarah had sung such a sweet, deadly song, was a masterpiece of forensic investigation. The first section contained Marcus Sterling's full report, a side-by-side comparison of the glamorous Amelia Dubois with the yearbook photo of the ambitious, hard-eyed Sarah Jenkins. It contained her birth certificate from Northwood, Pennsylvania, and, most chillingly, the newspaper clippings detailing her father's bankruptcy at the hands of Vance & Associates and his subsequent suicide. This was the foundation, the origin story of the villain. The next section, compiled by Arthur Schmidt, was a clinical, devastating map of the money. Spreadsheets with color-coded arrows showed the relentless flow of cash from Liam's accounts into Sarah's. It included the full corporate structure of the Helios Art and Antiquities Fund, exposing it as a hollow shell corporation with Sarah's alias as the sole director. Every fraudulent loan and extravagant gift was documented and totaled. David Chen's contribution was the legal weaponry. It contained an analysis of the unsigned power of attorney, with highlighted clauses explaining how it would have granted Sarah near absolute power over Liam's inheritance. But Sterling's team had delivered one final, crucial piece of evidence. After weeks of careful persuasion, they had convinced the man from Denver, the former fiancé of Chloe Martin, to come forward. He was a tech entrepreneur who had been both financially and emotionally devastated by Sarah. His sworn, notarized affidavit was the dossier's centerpiece, a first-hand account from a previous victim, detailing the exact same pattern of seduction, isolation, and financial fraud. It proved beyond any doubt that what had happened to Liam was not a romance gone wrong, but the work of a serial predator. With the weapon forged, Eleanor now had to design the stage. A public, messy accusation was not her style. She needed a controlled environment, a place where the truth could be unveiled with surgical precision. The trap had to be baited with something Sarah and Liam could not possibly resist. After a long discussion with David, they drafted an official letter on the law firm's letterhead. It was sent via courier to the temporary luxury apartment where Liam and Sarah were staying. The letter was a work of artful manipulation. It spoke of Eleanor's deep regret over the unfortunate events at the wedding and her sincere desire for reconciliation. It stated that, after a period of reflection, Eleanor wished to move forward and formally finalize the transfer of a significant portion of Liam's inheritance to him, as a gesture of goodwill and a foundation for his new life with Amelia. It requested their presence at the main conference room of Chen's law firm on Friday morning to sign the final documents. Eleanor knew her adversaries perfectly. She knew Sarah's blinding arrogance would interpret the letter as a white flag of surrender. The foolish, emotional mother had finally cracked and was ready to hand over the family fortune. For Sarah, it was the final, triumphant move in her long game of revenge. And Eleanor knew Liam, weak and desperate, would see it as the lifeline he had been praying for a chance for forgiveness, a return to his mother's good graces, and most importantly, a restoration of his access to the money that had always defined his existence. They would walk into the meeting expecting a signing ceremony. They would find a tribunal. The final piece of Eleanor's design was the audience. This could not happen in a vacuum. The integrity of the Vance name and the stability of the company were at stake. She made 2 phone calls. The first was to Robert Caldwell, her late husband's best friend and the most influential minority shareholder on the board of Vance and Associates. He was a man of unimpeachable integrity, a living link to the company's foundational values. "Robert," she said, her voice warm but firm, "I need a personal favor. I need you at David Chen's office on Friday morning at 10. It concerns a serious matter affecting the Vance legacy. I can't say more, but I need your counsel and your witness." Robert, who had known Eleanor for 35 years, asked no questions. "I'll be there." Her second call was to Catherine Hayes, the widow of the firm's co-founder and Eleanor's closest friend. Catherine was the doyenne of their social circle, a woman whose quiet opinion carried immense weight. "Catherine," Eleanor said, "I am about to face the most difficult day of my life since Richard died. I would be so grateful if you would be there with me." Like Robert, she agreed without hesitation. They were not just witnesses, they were her jury, pillars of the world Richard and she had built, and their presence would lend an unshakable gravity to the proceedings. On the Thursday night before the meeting, Eleanor sat alone in her study. The blue leather dossier lay closed on her desk. Every piece was in place. Every contingency had been planned for. She felt no anger, no satisfaction, only a profound and heavy sense of resolution. She was about to perform a painful, radical surgery on her own family, cutting out a malignant cancer, knowing that the wound she would leave in her own son would be deep and permanent. But it was the only way to save the whole. The architect had designed her final, terrible masterpiece. The stage was set, the lights were ready, and tomorrow the curtain would rise. The conference room at Chen, Hayes, and Caldwell was a cathedral of corporate power, a silent, imposing space of polished mahogany, black leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Eleanor was already seated at the head of the long table when the door opened. "Liam and Amelia know," Sarah entered, and for a moment they looked like the masters of this universe. Liam wore a suit Eleanor had bought him, a look of nervous relief on his face. Sarah was immaculate in a cream-colored Chanel suit, her hair perfectly styled, a confident, almost victorious smile playing on her lips. She carried a designer handbag like a trophy. Her smile faltered slightly when she saw they were not alone. Robert Caldwell and Catherine Hayes sat opposite the door, their expressions neutral, their presence an immediate and unnerving shift in the expected atmosphere. "Liam, Amelia," Eleanor said, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "Thank you for coming. I'm sure you know Robert Caldwell and my dear friend, Catherine Hayes." Sarah recovered quickly, her practiced charm clicking back into place. "Of course. How lovely to see you both," she said, extending a hand that neither of them made a move to take. They sat down, a tangible tension now filling the room. David Chen sat beside Eleanor, a thick, blue, leather-bound dossier placed squarely in front of him. "As my letter stated," Eleanor began, her gaze calm and direct, "we're here to discuss the finalization of Liam's inheritance and to move forward. But before we sign any documents, I feel it's important that we all understand the full context of the situation. So, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to tell you all a story." She picked up a small remote, and a large screen on the far wall flickered to life. "This is a story about a girl from a small town called Northwood, Pennsylvania, a town she was very desperate to escape." An image appeared on the screen. It was a high school yearbook photo of a pretty but severe-looking teenager with hungry eyes. Beneath it was the name, Sarah Jenkins. Liam squinted at the screen, a frown of confusion on his face. Sarah's body went rigid, the first hairline crack appearing in her perfect composure. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tight. "What does this have to do with anything?" Eleanor ignored her, her focus entirely on the narrative she was weaving. "This girl's father," she continued, clicking the remote, "was a man named Daniel Jenkins, a building contractor. 15 years ago, he took on a large subcontracting job for a developer, a company called Vance & Associates." The screen now showed scanned newspaper clippings. The headlines were stark. "Local contractor sues developer," "Jenkins contracting files for bankruptcy," and finally, a small, somber obituary for Daniel Jenkins. Liam's face went pale as he read the words. He looked from the screen to his mother, and then to the woman beside him, a dawning horror in his eyes. "This girl, Sarah." Eleanor's voice was like a steady, rhythmic drumbeat, believed that Vance & Associates had destroyed her family, and she decided to seek a very particular kind of revenge. Click. The screen changed again, now showing a photo of a glamorous blonde woman laughing on a yacht in Miami. So she left Northwood and became someone new. In Miami, she was an Italian heiress named Sofia Rossi. Click. A sworn, notarized affidavit from a man in Denver appeared, his face grim. And in Denver, she was the daughter of a Texas oilman, a woman named Chloe Martin. Both of these personas ended with her disappearing with a great deal of her lover's money. Liam made a small, choked sound, his hand rising to his mouth. He was looking at Sarah now, truly looking at her, and the beautiful, familiar face of his fiancée was contorting into the mask of a stranger. "This is insane," Sarah hissed, her voice losing its melodic cultivation, becoming sharp and raw. "This is a fabrication. Eleanor, you're a bitter old woman trying to poison your son against me because you couldn't stand to lose him." Her eyes darted toward Liam, searching for an ally, but she found none. He was staring at the next image on the screen, his world visibly collapsing. It was the corporate flowchart for the Helios Art and Antiquities Fund, a web of shell corporations leading to a single director, Helene Delacroix, an alias linked by international banking records directly to Sarah Jenkins. "An entirely fictional investment fund," Eleanor stated calmly, "created for the sole purpose of defrauding my son of $2 million. "Liam, darling, don't listen to her," Sarah pleaded, her hand reaching for his arm, but he flinched away from her touch as if burned. The final slide appeared. It was a high-resolution scan of the durable power of attorney document, his own trusting, foolish signature displayed for everyone to see. "And this," Eleanor said, her voice dropping, filled with a cold, quiet fury, "is the document that would have given you, Sarah, the legal power to destroy my family from within." The silence that followed was absolute. It was broken by Sarah. Her mask didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The elegant, sophisticated Amelia Dubois vanished, and the raw, hate-filled Sarah Jenkins was finally revealed. "You deserved it," she shrieked, her voice raw with years of pent-up rage, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. "You and your perfect, ruthless husband. You sat in your ivory tower and crushed my father like he was nothing. You took our home, our life, our dignity. You have any idea what it was like? I did what I had to do. And him," she spat, turning on Liam with pure venom. "He was a fool, so desperate for love, so easy to lead. He believed every ridiculous story I told him because he's a weak, pathetic boy who's never had to fight for a single thing in his life." Liam simply crumbled. He bent forward, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The entire edifice of his love, his happiness, his future had been a lie, a weapon used against his own family, and he had been its most willing accomplice. He was not the victim of a simple con. He was the cause of a near catastrophe, a fool of monumental proportions. Robert Caldwell and Catherine Hayes looked on, their faces etched with a grim, sorrowful understanding. This was worse than they could have imagined. Eleanor watched the scene she had orchestrated, her face impassive. She felt no triumph, only the profound, aching emptiness of a necessary amputation. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to David Chen. The lawyer stood up, his presence instantly shifting the room from a family tragedy to a legal proceeding. He placed several documents on the table in front of Sarah. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice formal and cold, "this is a summons. A civil suit has been filed against you on behalf of the Vance family and its holdings for fraud, conspiracy, and fraudulent inducement. We are seeking the return of all assets, plus punitive damages." He slid another document forward. "This is a court order, signed by a judge this morning, freezing any and all of your known assets, both domestic and international, pending the outcome of that suit." "Finally," he said, tapping the blue dossier, "a copy of all of our findings, including the affidavits from your other victims, has been delivered to the office of the district attorney. You should expect to be hearing from them regarding a criminal investigation very shortly. I suggest you find a lawyer. This meeting is over." The aftermath in the conference room was not loud, but the silence was deafening, charged with the wreckage of shattered lives. Sarah Jenkins stood frozen for a long moment, the legal documents on the table before her like a death sentence. The venomous rage in her eyes slowly gave way to the flat, dead-eyed look of a cornered animal. The fight was over. The game was lost. Without another word, she turned, her shoulders slumped, the Chanel suit now looking like a cheap costume on a broken mannequin. She walked out of the room, not with the defiant exit of a villain, but with the quiet, shuffling gait of a person who had just become a ghost. Robert and Catherine rose, each placing a supportive hand on Eleanor's shoulder before quietly excusing themselves, leaving the final, painful act of this family tragedy to play out in private. That left only Eleanor and Liam, adrift in the wreckage. Liam was still hunched over in his chair, his sobs having subsided into a series of ragged, hitching breaths. He looked up at his mother, his face pale and tear-streaked, his eyes filled with the lost, terrified expression of a little boy who had just woken from a nightmare. He looked like he was 12 years old again, expecting her to make it all better. The drive home was a study in shared misery. Not a single word was spoken. Liam stared out the window at a city he no longer recognized, while Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the road, her jaw set, her mind clear and resolved. The silence was its own verdict, a heavy, suffocating blanket of shame and disappointment. They walked into the grand, sunlit foyer of the house he had always called home. It was here that Liam's composure finally and completely broke. He fell apart, not with the dignity of a remorseful man, but with the desperate panic of a child. "Mom, I am so sorry," he wept, his words tumbling over each other. "I'm so sorry. I was a fool. I was so stupid. She twisted everything. She made me believe you were the enemy, that you were trying to control me. I never wanted to hurt you. I swear I didn't. Please," he begged, his voice cracking as he reached for her hands. "Please, Mom, you have to forgive me. Now that she's gone, we can fix this. We can go back to how things were." He was looking for absolution, for the comforting embrace that had always been there to erase his mistakes. He was expecting the familiar rhythm of his life to resume, his foolish error, his mother's anger, and then, inevitably, her forgiveness and the restoration of his perfect, frictionless world. He did not understand that the woman standing before him was not the same mother he had betrayed. Eleanor gently pulled her hands away from his grasp. She looked at her son, her beautiful, broken boy, and she felt a deep, profound ache, but it was the ache of a surgeon assessing a wound, not the consuming grief of a mother. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud or angry. It was quiet, measured, and carried the devastating weight of finality. "I know you are hurting, Liam," she began, her tone compassionate but firm. "And I know that you were the victim of a very, very skilled predator. She targeted you, and she manipulated you, and for the foolishness of being deceived, I can forgive you. Love can make a fool of anyone." Liam's face began to fill with hope, but Eleanor held up a hand to stop him. "But that is not what broke my heart," she continued, her voice dropping slightly. "My heart did not break in that conference room today when I learned the extent of her lies. It broke 2 weeks ago, in the garden of the wedding I built for you. It broke when you stood there, silent, and you watched that woman dismiss me from my own son's life like I was a member of the staff. You said nothing." Her eyes, clear and unwavering, locked onto his. "Your silence was a choice, Liam. In that moment, you chose her comfort over my dignity. You chose her lie over your own family. You did not just betray my trust. You betrayed the memory of your father. You took the legacy of strength and sacrifice that we built for you, and you handed it over to a stranger without a second thought, because it was easier than standing up for what was right." Liam opened his mouth to protest, to make excuses, but she cut him off. "There are no more excuses. The time for them is over. You have lived your entire life in a gilded cage, protected from consequence. That ends today." She took a steadying breath. "The Sterling Trust Fund will remain frozen indefinitely. Your credit cards have been canceled. Your car, which is in the company's name, will be returned. And this house," she said, her voice softening with a hint of sorrow, "is no longer your home. You are 28 years old. It is long past time you learned what it means to be a man." Liam stared at her, his expression one of utter disbelief, as if she had just started speaking in a foreign language. "What? What are you saying? Where am I supposed to go?" "That," she said, "is something you will have to figure out for yourself. Your father and I started with nothing but our minds and our will to succeed. The greatest inheritance we can give you is the opportunity to discover if you have any of that inside of you. You will get a job. You will pay rent. You will learn the value of a dollar that you have earned yourself, not one that has simply been given to you." It was a death sentence to the life he knew. It was also, she knew, his only chance at a real one. An hour later, Liam came down the grand staircase, carrying a single suitcase. His entire life of privilege and ease had been reduced to what he could carry. He looked lost, a ghost in his own home. He stopped at the door, turning to her one last time, his eyes pleading. "Mom, please. I love you, Liam," she said, and it was the truth. "But my love is no longer a safety net. Go and build a life worthy of the Vance name. Perhaps one day, that life will lead you back here." He lingered for a second longer, hoping for a reprieve that would not come. Then he turned and walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. Eleanor stood alone in the vast, silent foyer. She had won. The enemy was vanquished, the company was secure, the legacy was protected. But as the silence of the empty house settled around her, she had never felt less like a victor. She was the queen of a silent, lonely kingdom, and she had just sent her only heir into exile. 6 months passed. The violent storm of the wedding and its aftermath subsided, leaving behind a quiet, altered landscape. The name Sarah Jenkins became a cautionary whisper in certain circles before fading into the city's churn of new scandals. She had taken a plea bargain, her future now a sterile sequence of legal proceedings and, eventually, a correctional facility. Liam had disappeared from the life he knew. Eleanor heard, through a concerned Catherine Hayes, that he was working as a waiter in a city a few hundred miles away, sharing a cramped apartment with 2 roommates. He had not tried to contact her again. For Eleanor, the silence was both a relief and a constant low-grade ache. She had poured her renewed energy back into Vance and Associates, taking a more active role than she had in a decade. The work was a comfort, its clean lines and solvable problems a welcome antidote to the messy, unsolvable equations of her personal life. She was, by all accounts, a woman who had faced a devastating betrayal and emerged stronger, a matriarch who had successfully defended her empire. But in the quiet hours of the night, in the vast, empty house, the victory felt indistinguishable from loss. One crisp autumn afternoon, a sleek, unmarked courier box arrived at her office. Inside, there was no letter, only a slim, secure hard drive and a single handwritten note on Marcus Sterling's personal stationery. It read, "Eleanor, the case is closed, but my research turned up one final, loose thread concerning the original incident. I felt you deserved to have the complete picture. Marcus." A cold knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. She took the drive home and, in the solitude of her study, plugged it into her laptop. There was only one file, a PDF, titled The Northgate Addendum. It was not a collection of raw data, but a narrative, pieced together from old, archived corporate emails from Vance and Associates, forgotten legal memos, and a newly discovered deposition from a disgruntled project manager who had left the firm shortly after the Northgate project. What it revealed was not a simple, hard-fought business dispute. It was an execution. Daniel Jenkins, as Richard had claimed, had been in over his head. His bid was too low, and he was struggling. But Richard had not simply enforced the contract. He had used it as a weapon. The file contained an email chain in which Richard, against the advice of his then lawyers, instructed his team to exploit a little-known clause in the supply chain agreement. They had placed a legal lien on all of Daniel Jenkins' materials and equipment assets he was using for 3 other smaller jobs, citing a potential default on the Northgate project. It was a legally aggressive but technically permissible maneuver. It was also a death blow. By seizing his assets, Richard had not only made it impossible for Jenkins to finish the Vance and Associates project, but he had crippled his ability to continue any of his other work. He had engineered the very bankruptcy he then sued him for. It had not been business. It had been a systematic, ruthless annihilation of a smaller, weaker competitor. Eleanor felt the room grow cold. This was a betrayal of a different, more profound kind. It was a betrayal of memory. For 10 years, she had polished the legacy of her husband into a flawless monument of brilliance, charm, and integrity. She had built her life, and her son's life, around the worship of this perfect man. Now, with a single keystroke, that monument had developed a spiderweb of cracks. She looked up at the portrait of Richard over the fireplace, at his confident, easy smile, and for the first time, she saw the cold glint of a predator in his eyes. He was the man who had held her and loved her, the man who had cried at the birth of their son. He was also the man who had methodically destroyed Daniel Jenkins and then dismissed him as a local yokel, never mentioning the brutal tactics he had employed. The entire narrative of her life had been a lie of omission. Her perfect marriage, her beautiful home, the very foundation of the wealth she had fought so hard to protect it, was all tainted, fertilized by the quiet suffering of a family in a forgotten town in Pennsylvania. Sarah Jenkins was a monster, a con artist, a criminal. That truth had not changed. But Eleanor now understood that she was a monster of their own making. She was the dark and twisted consequence of a single, casual act of corporate cruelty. The righteousness of Eleanor's victory turned to ash in her mouth. She had won, yes, but she had been defending a kingdom built on a corrupted cornerstone. A week later, she called David Chen. Her instructions were quiet and precise. She was establishing a new charitable foundation. It would be called the Northwood Promise Fund, endowed with an initial, anonymous donation of $5 million. Its mission was to provide university scholarships and trade school grants to every qualifying student from Northwood, Pennsylvania, in perpetuity. It was not an apology. It was not an admission. It was a quiet, anonymous act of penance, an attempt to bring some light back to a place from which her family had taken so much. Eleanor stood on the balcony of her office, looking out at the skyline she and Richard had helped to shape. Her justice had been served, and Sarah Jenkins was facing hers. But the truth, she now realized, was a far more complex and elusive creature. It was not a single, shining beacon, but a prism, scattering light into 100 different shades of blame and pain and regret. Her actions had been right, necessary, but the cause of it all had been born in her own house. The thought brought to mind a final, chilling lesson, a piece of wisdom earned at an unbearable price. Never underestimate the quiet of a person who has endured too much, because when they finally break their silence, it is not just their own story they tell, but the ugly, hidden truths of everyone around them.